Under the great baobab tree, where the roots clawed deep into the red earth like the fingers of old spirits, the village gathered. The fire cracked and spat into the night air, sending up sparks that danced with the stars. Children sat cross-legged, wide-eyed, their faces glowing with the fire's light. The elders leaned closer on their carved stools, their hands wrapped around walking sticks, their hearts wrapped around memories they dared not speak aloud. In the heart of the circle sat the griot, his skin dark as the fertile soil after rain, his hair a crown of wiry silver. His voice, when it rose, was the rustle of ancient leaves, the rumble of distant thunder. He tapped his staff once against the ground, and the crowd hushed as if the night itself leaned in to listen. "There is a silence that falls before a storm," he began, his voice low and heavy with meaning. "A silence so deep that even the birds in the acacia trees hold their breath. The river forgets its song. The wind folds its wings. That silence is not peace, it is the warning of a sorrow so great, the earth itself prepares to weep." The children shivered, some drawing their cloaks tighter. The old women murmured prayers under their breath. The griot's eyes, clouded with the wisdom of too many years, swept the circle. "I will tell you tonight," he said, "of a family that lived with pride so sharp it could cut the skin, so blind it could not see the storm gathering above them." His gnarled hands moved slowly, tracing pictures in the air. Of a man whose heart, once warm as sunrise, turned colder than the mountain stones. Of a woman whose spirit bent and bent until it nearly broke. He paused. The fire cracked loudly, scattering tiny embers that floated like fireflies into the night. But most of all, the griot whispered, and his voice gained the trembling strength of a drumbeat, "I will tell you of a daughter. A girl born from sorrow and hope alike, whose voice rose up when even the lions had fallen silent. A girl whose words shattered chains thicker than iron, heavier than grief." The listeners leaned in closer. Some felt a tightening in their chests, though they could not yet say why. A low drumbeat began in the distance, as if the ancestors themselves tapped their feet to the story's rhythm. "She was small," the griot said, his voice almost breaking into a chant, but the fire inside her was as fierce as the desert sun. When the moment came, when the world looked away and shame wrapped her mother in chains, she did not run. She did not hide. She stood. The flames leapt higher as if reaching to touch the power of those words. Shadows danced wildly across the village square, and the baobab's branches seemed to tremble. In her voice was the roar of the ancestors. In her words, the judgment of all who had suffered in silence before her. And when she spoke, the proud were humbled, the cruel exposed, and the broken set free. The griot tapped his staff again, and the fire seemed to bow to him. "This is the story of Zola," he said, voice deep with sorrow and pride. "The girl who taught a village to listen. The girl who dared to lift her face to the storm and sing." The fire crackled on. The night deepened. And the village, drawn into the spell of the old man's voice, waited to hear how a single small voice could change the fate of many. The silence, thick and trembling, wrapped around them like a living thing, the silence before the storm. It was many seasons ago, when the baobab tree was younger and its branches not yet heavy with the weight of 100 harvests, that the village gathered once more beneath its broad arms to celebrate the union of Ao and Simi. The drums were wild that night, beating so fast and strong that even the stars seemed to pulse in rhythm. Smoke from roasting meats rose into the dusk, carrying with it the rich scents of cumin and firewood, and laughter tumbled like water over smooth stones. Ao, tall and broad-shouldered, with a smile that could melt even the sternest elder's heart, stood beneath a canopy of woven grasses. His skin gleamed with palm oil, and bright blue beads circled his neck. Simi approached him, moving like a river goddess in a gown of deep indigo, her hair braided with tiny white shells that clicked softly as she walked. Her eyes held a light that no earthly flame could rival, and when she smiled, the earth itself seemed to sigh. The griots sang songs of old love stories, their voices rising and falling like birds caught on a warm breeze. Children raced about, tossing handfuls of cowrie shells onto the ground, blessings for wealth and fertility. The eldest women blessed the union with hands worn from years of planting and weaving, touching Ao and Simi's foreheads with ash and sweet oil. The youngest girls peered from behind their mothers' skirts, dreaming of their own weddings yet to come. That night, it seemed nothing could darken the horizon of their future. The villagers spoke of it in low, reverent tones. Ao and Simi were as matched as twin stars, destined to shine side by side forever. Their love was a river in flood season, strong, wild, unstoppable, sweeping all in its path into a future bright with green fields and healthy children. When Ao looked at Simi, it was as though no other soul existed. When Simi laughed, Ao's chest lifted with pride, as if the gods themselves had chosen him for her. As the moon rose full and heavy above them, the village feasted. Goats were roasted over open flames, millet beer flowed like a golden river, and dancers leapt and spun until their feet blurred against the earth. Elders told stories late into the night, blessing the new couple with words of wisdom, patience, forgiveness, shared dreams. A child was handed to Simi, a blessing from the oldest mother, and Simi cradled the babe against her heart as if practicing for the life she would soon bring into the world. But even in the midst of the laughter and music, small seeds of jealousy were being sown. In the far corners of the gathering, whispered voices questioned whether Simi's spirit burned too brightly, whether Ao would one day grow weary of a wife who matched his will with her own. Ao's cousins, who had hoped to see him wed a girl from their own bloodline, exchanged looks sharp enough to cut through bone. Old rivalries and quiet envies slithered through the grass like unseen snakes. No river, no matter how mighty, flows forever without challenge. And love, even a love as fierce and beautiful as Ao and Simi's, could not remain untouched by the shadowy hands of doubt and pride. In the early hours before dawn, after the last drumbeats faded and the last embers glowed low in the pits, Ao and Simi lay beneath the woven roof of their new home, their hands entwined, their bodies weary from joy. They whispered promises to each other, words too soft for any ear but their own. They dreamed of children, of fields ripe with harvest, of gray hairs and grandchildren circling their feet. The river of their love ran fast and deep, carving its way through the landscape of their lives. But even the strongest river must watch for the poison that creeps in slow, hidden currents. Poison that can take root in silence, in misunderstanding, in the unspoken bitterness of others. That night, all they knew was joy. That night, they slept easy, wrapped in the warmth of each other and the blessing of the village. But the griot, who watched from the edge of the firelight, saw farther. He saw the way the cowrie shells had fallen that night, not all face up, as they should in an omen of perfect fortune. A few had landed cracked and downturned, whispering of trials yet to come. Still, even he did not know how far the river would be forced to bend before it broke. The seasons turned, as they always did, and the days spun themselves into long threads of golden harvests and rains that sang on the rooftops. At first, Ao and Simi's life was all that had been promised, sweet mornings filled with laughter, evenings spent by the fireside with hands brushing together like the soft meeting of leaves. Their love was a rhythm, a heartbeat steady and true. But even the strongest drums can be drowned out by the low, persistent hiss of whispers. It began quietly. A glance exchanged between two elder women as Simi walked past, her head high and her stride sure. A murmured word half swallowed in the shade of the thatched kitchens. Too proud, one said, her voice dry as harmattan winds. Too clever by half, another replied, snapping a yam in two as if splitting a future. At the well, as the women pulled buckets heavy with water, the talk would rise like steam. They noted how Simi spoke her mind with the village men and did not lower her gaze at their teasing. They clucked their tongues over how she stood beside Ao, not behind him, as tradition whispered she should. They muttered that a woman who shone too brightly was sure to burn the hands that held her. The words slid under doorways, seeped into the cracks between stones. They found Ao where he worked, mending fishing nets or turning the soil with his brothers. "Your wife," they said, laughing low, "she thinks herself a queen already." Ao laughed with them at first, shaking off the teasing as men often do. But the words clung to him like burrs on a hunter's cloak. They followed him home, curling around his shoulders when he sat beside Simi. They whispered in his ear when she laughed too freely at a joke he did not understand, when she spoke boldly to the elders at the council fires. In time, Ao began to see things he had never noticed before. The quick lift of Simi's chin when she disagreed. The spark in her eyes when she challenged a decision. Where once he had admired her spirit, now a small seed of irritation began to sprout. The cracks in their foundation were hair-thin at first, barely felt beneath their feet. But they grew. Ayo's mother, a woman with hands as hard as river stones and a tongue to match, took him aside one evening as the cicadas sang. She spoke of loyalty, of the duty of a wife to honor her husband, to soften herself like butter before him. She warned of the dangers of a woman who thought herself equal to her man. She sowed her words like seeds into the soil of Ayo's mind, watering them with old sayings and grim examples from the past. Simi, for her part, felt the shift long before it was named. She saw the way Ayo's smile thinned when she offered her ideas. She felt the chill that entered their bed like a snake when she spoke of her hopes and plans. She tasted the bitterness in his kisses, a bitterness that had not been there before. She tried to reach him, to hold fast to the love they had built with such fierce hope. She wrapped her arms around him at night and whispered the old songs they had sung when they first courted. She bent herself into shapes that did not fit, tried to be smaller, quieter, gentler. But rivers do not change their course without pain. Each small hurt piled atop the last. Each word Ayo did not speak. Each smile Simi did not return. The invisible stones of resentment stacked higher and higher until even love, strong as it had been, struggled to breathe under their weight. Behind closed doors, the cracks grew wider. And always, outside those walls, the whispers fanned the flames. The elder women watched with sharp eyes, hiding their satisfaction beneath folded arms. The younger wives learned from Simi's struggle, shrinking themselves even more in their husbands' shadows. The men, who once admired Ayo's bold bride, now shook their heads as if Simi's strength was a curse Ayo had failed to tame. The baobab tree that had once sheltered their joy now bore silent witness to their slow unraveling. Its roots dug deeper into the earth, as if bracing for the storm it knew was coming. The griot, when he passed their home, bowed his head. For he too could see it, the once mighty river had begun to silt, its waters fouled by the poison of envy and pride. It would not be long before the flood came. Ayo, who had once been the laughter that rose higher than the drumbeats, began to change in ways even he could not see. Slowly, steadily, as the seasons spun their old songs, the warmth that had drawn Simi to him now burned too hot, too fierce. His eyes, once soft as rain on dry earth, hardened into the gray of gathering storm clouds. At first, the changes were small. A tightening of his jaw when Simi spoke at the village gatherings. A coldness in his voice when she corrected him, even gently, over the names of distant cousins. He began to interrupt her in conversations, his words slicing across hers like the swift, careless blow of a machete through tall grass. The village noticed. How could they not? Once, Simi and Ayo had been the heart of every dance, the ones who spun together in easy rhythm, whose laughter braided into the music itself. Now, Simi's laughter faltered before it ever left her lips, as Ayo stood nearby, arms crossed, a wall where once he had been a bridge. Ayo began to scold her, first in the privacy of their home, where the mud walls absorbed the bruises of his words. Then, emboldened by the nods and approving murmurs of his kin, he began to do it before others. A sharp word here, a clipped rebuke there. If Simi spoke too long to a neighbor, he called her foolish. If she offered advice on planting or on trade, he silenced her with a frown deep enough to split stone. The first time he raised his voice to her in the marketplace, the crowd stilled. Even the goats seemed to stop their bleating. Simi stood frozen, holding a basket heavy with cassava, her face a careful mask. Inside, 1,000 pieces of her heart clattered to the ground, unseen by all but the griot, who leaned heavily on his staff in the shadow of the baobab tree. In the evenings, Ayo no longer listened to the songs Simi hummed as she ground millet or stirred the stew. Instead, he sat with the other men, drinking strong palm wine and trading stories that grew louder and crueler as the gourd emptied. If Simi approached to gently touch his shoulder, he would shrug her off as though her fingers were thorns. At night, their mat was colder. The spaces between their bodies grew wider, yawning chasms filled with words unsaid and forgiveness unoffered. Simi still tried, at first, still lit the lamps with hope, still set his favorite dishes before him, still braided her hair with beads he once said reminded him of the stars. But love, even love as fierce as hers, wilts when left too long without sunlight. In the stillness of the dark, when the fires had burned low and the children's dreams floated high into the rafters, Simi wept quietly, tears slipping into her hairline, staining the woven mat. She remembered the Ao who had once plucked flowers for her from the highest branches, risking the scolding of the spirits. She mourned him as one mourns a fallen warrior, gone not by death but by a slow erosion of spirit. Meanwhile, Ao, wrapped in a brittle shell of pride, mistook her silence for shame, her bowed head for repentance. He believed the whispers that had become his gospel, that a man must rule his house with a heavy hand, that a clever woman must be broken before she breaks him. What Ao forgot, what the elders had forgotten in their harsh lessons and cruel jokes, was the wisdom the griots once sang, that a lion who roars too fiercely at his mate will one day find himself alone, his den silent, his bed cold as ash. The village watched and gossiped, clucking tongues and shaking heads, pretending surprise though many had helped weave the web in which Ao now struggled. And Simi, oh Simi, still bore herself with the grace of the river's bend, but inside, her spirit began to whisper a different song. A song not of bending and yielding, but of remembering. Of strength. Of fire hidden beneath river stones. The griot knew. He saw it in the way Simi's eyes no longer pleaded but watched, calm and certain as the old moon. He saw it in the way she gathered her daughter close, teaching her not how to bow, but how to stand. Ao did not yet see the storm he had summoned with his own hand. But soon, the sky would split wide open. Zola came into the world like a spark catching dry grass, a flash of wonder, a sudden, necessary brightness. Born when the river of her parents' love had already begun to dry and crack, she became both balm and burden, laughter and longing intertwined. From her earliest days, Zola was a creature of movement. She danced barefoot in the dust, chasing dragonflies whose wings shimmered like the necklaces worn by the village queens of old. Her laughter, high and wild, floated through the air and wrapped itself around the hearts of all who heard it. Even the sternest elders found their mouths softening when she tumbled past, skirts flying and braids trailing behind her like comet tails. To the village, Zola was a joy, a bright thing among the weary. But within the thin walls of her home, she was something more, a tiny stitch attempting to sew together a fabric tearing at every seam. Zola, even in her innocence, sensed the fractures in the air. She heard the sharpness in her father's voice, felt the sorrow her mother wore like a second skin. When the nights grew too heavy and the fire guttered low, she would creep from her sleeping mat to where Simi sat alone, her arms wrapped around herself. She would climb into her mother's lap, fitting there like a missing piece, and sing nonsense songs until Simi's shoulders stopped shaking. Her mother never spoke of her sadness, not in words. It hung around her instead, an invisible fog that Zola could neither name nor escape. Some nights, when the moon was sharp and white in the sky, Zola would wake to the sound of Simi's quiet weeping. At first, she had been afraid that the tears would sweep them all away. But soon, the sound became as familiar to her as the rustle of the trees in the night wind. It was the song she fell asleep to, her first and deepest lullaby. In the daytime, Zola threw herself into joy with the fierce determination only children possess. She spun and twirled in the open fields, letting the warm earth kiss her feet. She shouted greetings to the birds, pretended the goats were her royal subjects, and built palaces of mud and dreams by the riverbank. She stitched happiness into the days wherever she could, patching the broken cloth of their family life with her bright little hands. She would grab Ao's hand and pull him to dance with her when he came home tight-lipped and tired. Sometimes he allowed it, a stiff smile cracking his face, and for a few precious heartbeats, the man Simi had loved flickered back into existence. Other times he pushed her away with a gruff word, sending her skittering like a startled fawn. Still, she tried. With her mother, Zola's love was a softer thing, a weaving of fingers through loose hair, a shared mango beneath the shade of the baobab, a whispered secret into the hollow of Simi's neck. She did not know all the words for sorrow, but she knew how to bind herself close around it, making it a little easier to bear. Even the villagers noticed. They said that Zola's laughter could heal a broken drum, that her smile could coax flowers from dry ground. They praised her beauty, too, the tilt of her chin, the flash of her bright eyes, but always, it was her spirit they spoke of most. That girl, they said, is touched by something greater. Still, Zola could not mend everything. For all her light, the shadows in her home grew longer. She watched, helpless, as her father's love turned brittle, as her mother's eyes dulled to the color of storm water. She carried the weight of that helplessness the way some children carry invisible stones, heavy, hidden, shaping the way they walk in the world. But even stones can be used to build. Even sorrow can become the seed of something stronger. Zola did not know it yet, but deep inside her, a fire had been kindled, a fierce, unyielding flame born of every tear she had witnessed, every harsh word she had heard, every night she had curled herself around her mother's aching heart. A fire that, when the time came, would not be silenced. A fire that would change everything. The Feast of Broken Masks came once a year, a night when the village gathered to honor those who had walked before, the ancestors whose whispers shaped the winds and whose hands molded the soil. It was a night of deep reverence, and deeper secrets. From early morning, the air buzzed with preparations. Women pounded yam into soft white clouds, their mortars thudding in steady rhythms like heartbeat drums. Men sharpened knives for the roasting of goats and shaped mats of woven grass for the elders to sit upon. Children were sent to the river with baskets to fetch the sweetest water, their laughter skipping over the current like pebbles. But this year, the village felt different to Simi. Heavier, somehow, as if the very ground held its breath. As she moved among the preparations, her skin prickled as though unseen eyes watched her every step. She smiled, as was expected, and dipped her hands into bowls of spices, grinding them into the flesh of the meat, but her heart beat in uneven rhythm. By tradition, every villager wore a mask to the feast. Some were carved with the faces of mighty ancestors, others painted with the symbols of prosperity, fertility, strength. Officially, the masks honored the spirits, but everyone knew they served another purpose too, to conceal. To say what could not be said. To hide the raw, bruised truths that lived in every home and heart. Simi spent the afternoon crafting a mask of her own. She chose soft clay from the riverbank, shaping it with care. She painted it white for mourning, gold for hope, and a single thin red line across the mouth, a wound left unspoken. Zola fashioned her mask with the bright abandon of youth, decorating it with feathers and crushed berries, laughing as she worked. She begged Simi to smile, tugging gently at the corners of her lips, and for her daughter's sake, Simi forced one upward. Ayo's mask was simpler. Dark, heavy wood carved into the grim visage of an ancient warrior. It suited him. As the sun set and the sky bled into deep purple, the villagers gathered around the great baobab, whose gnarled roots clawed at the earth like the fingers of sleeping giants. Fires blazed in circles, casting dancing shadows that turned the masked villagers into living spirits. Drums began to beat, low at first, then rising, building, stitching together the fabric of the night. Simi walked beside Ayo, Zola skipping just ahead of them, her little mask bobbing like a bright fish in dark waters. Every smile directed at them felt strained, every greeting a blade hidden in silk. Simi knew the whispers that followed her like a second skin, Simi, the proud one. Simi, who let her husband grow distant. Simi, who thought herself better than the old ways. At the edge of the firelight, Ayo's family waited. His mother, a woman carved from anger and old pride, wore a mask of painted thorns. His sisters, draped in fine cloth, bore masks glittering with tiny mirrors, reflecting, deflecting, refusing to be truly seen. They welcomed Ayo with cloying sweetness, offering him roasted meats, sweet wines, and loud laughter. They barely looked at Simi. The griot, ancient and robed in the deep blue of twilight, stood to begin the ceremony. His voice rose above the drums, weaving a tale of a time when masks were not needed, when truth and love had no need for hiding. His words fell like rain on parched ground, but few truly listened. Too many had learned to love the safety of their masks. As the feasting began, Simi sat stiffly among Ayo's kin, her mask hot against her face. She lifted her bowl, drank the spiced wine, tasted bitterness beneath the sweetness. Around her, the laughter grew louder, sharper, the firelight flickering and twisting the masked faces into something monstrous. Simi's dread thickened. She could feel the tension in Ao's shoulders, see the way his hands tightened around his cup. Tonight, something would break, she could feel it humming through her bones. Zola, sensing the storm, clung to her mother's side, small hands seeking comfort. Simi squeezed her hand in return, a silent promise, I am here. I will not break. Then it happened. Ao stood. The drums faltered, the conversation stuttered into awkward silence. All eyes turned toward him. Without a word, he grabbed Simi roughly by the wrist and dragged her to the center of the gathering. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even behind their masks, the villagers' shock was naked. Simi stumbled but did not fall. She steadied herself, lifting her chin, the thin red line across her mask burning like a scar. Ao's voice boomed over the fire, bitter and thick with drink. He spoke of shame, of disobedience, of a wife who no longer knew her place. His words lashed her like whips, each one striking the tender places in her heart. The masked crowd watched, some with glee, others with guilt. No one moved to stop him. After all, hadn't they encouraged this? Hadn't they sown these seeds? Simi stood motionless, the flames casting her long shadow across the dust. She said nothing, though her heart screamed inside her chest. And through it all, Zola stood nearby, her tiny hands clenched into fists, her body trembling. The griot watched too, his eyes dark and sorrowful beneath his own simple mask. He knew. He had seen too many such nights before. But no one, not Ao, not Simi, not the gathering crowd, was prepared for what the little girl would do next. For the storm was no longer brewing. It had arrived. Ao's grip was iron around Simi's wrist, his nails digging into her skin as he dragged her through the dust. The masked villagers parted like water before a storm, giving them a wide, gaping path to the fire where the elders sat. The drums that had once pounded the heartbeat of the night sputtered and died into a stunned silence. Simi stumbled after him, her feet scraping the earth, her heart thundering louder than the drums ever could. She kept her mask on, feeling the thin clay tremble against her skin. All around them, the villagers watched with hungry eyes, their masks frozen into ghastly smiles and hollow glares. No one reached out a hand. No one spoke. At the foot of the great baobab, the elders waited. Their masks were solemn, the leopard, the crane, the tortoise. Each one heavy with the weight of years and judgment. They sat atop carved stools, their robes rich with embroidered symbols of the ancestors. To be dragged before them was not just shame, it was a breaking, a public branding of failure. Ao threw Simi forward, so she landed hard on her knees before the sacred fire. Dust clung to her, mixing with the sweat on her skin. Still, she did not bow her head. She would not give them that satisfaction. Her heart burned hotter than the flames beside her. Ao's voice rang out, sharp and clear. I bring my wife before the council, he said, the words formal, ritualistic, deadly. She has shamed me. She has shamed our house. A murmur stirred the masked faces. They shifted, or rustling like dead leaves in a dry season. She speaks with too much pride, Ao continued, his chest swelling with each accusation. She forgets her place among her husband's people. She brings dishonor with her stubbornness, her sharp tongue, her coldness. Each word fell like a stone into a deep well. Heavy. Final. Condemning. Simi knelt in the dust and said nothing. She thought of Zola, standing somewhere behind her, watching with wide, terrified eyes. She thought of the girl's laughter, her bright spirit, her endless hope. That hope must not be crushed here tonight. The elders listened, their masks unreadable. The leopard leaned forward, his hand gripping a staff carved with snakes. He spoke, his voice slow and deep. And what say you, woman? Simi opened her mouth, and closed it again. What could she say? That Ao's love had soured because he had listened to the bitter tongues of his sisters and mother? That she had loved him once with a heart so full it ached, only to watch him pour that love out into the dust? That she had swallowed every insult, every cold glance, for the sake of peace? But no one here wanted the truth. They wanted a scapegoat. They wanted a spectacle. Simi lifted her chin, the red line across her mask gleaming in the firelight. She would not beg. She would not weep. The leopard elder tilted his head. No defense, he rumbled. Behind Simi, Ao sneered. See? Even now, she is too proud to lower herself. The crane elder, her voice soft but slicing, added, a woman must know her place. If she forgets, the whole house collapses. The villagers nodded, their masks bobbing like storm-tossed boats. Some clutched their robes tighter, others leaned forward, eager for the final blow. Ao stepped closer. His shadow swallowed Simi's form. His voice dropped low, but it carried across the silent crowd. I ask the council to judge her, he said, to teach her humility. It was the final betrayal. Not just accusation, not just shame. He was offering her up like a lamb to be slaughtered. Simi closed her eyes. For a moment, she let the sorrow wash over her, tried to find a place inside herself that still remembered how to breathe. Her heart twisted, but deep underneath, a seed of something fiercer stirred. From the edges of the gathering, a child's voice rang out, thin but sharp enough to cut the night in two. Stop! The word cracked through the air like a whip. Heads turned. The elders sat up straighter. Even Ao froze, his mouth hanging open. Zola pushed her way through the crowd, her small body quivering with rage and fear. She wore her feathered mask pushed up onto her head, her fierce little face bare to the world. I will not be silent, she cried, voice shaking but unbroken. You hurt her. You shame her because you are too weak to see your own fault. Gasps rippled through the villagers. A child, speaking against her father before the council? Unheard of. Unthinkable. But Zola pressed on, her words tumbling out like a river bursting its banks. She loved you. She loved all of you. And you spit it back at her like poison. You hide behind your masks, but I see you. I see your fear and your meanness. The griot smiled behind his mask, a soft, secret smile. The storm had not just arrived, it had found its thunder. The elders exchanged glances, murmuring low. The sacred order of the night had been broken, not by Simi, but by the fierce, furious truth spilling from her daughter's lips. Simi rose slowly from the dust, feeling something uncoil in her chest. Something wild. Something free. The fire roared higher, as if feeding on the truth at last spoken aloud. And nothing, not Ao's anger, not the villagers' fear, not even the weight of tradition itself, could put it back into silence again. Zola's small body trembled under the wide, heavy eyes of the village. Around her, the adults clutched their masks tighter, as if the thin slivers of clay could shield them from the truth blazing out of her. Some turned their faces away. Others lowered their heads. Not a single one stepped forward. Not a single hand reached out to stop what was happening. The drums remained silent. The very trees seemed to hold their breath. Zola's heart beat so wildly she thought it might leap from her chest. Fear clawed at her throat, but something deeper roared inside her, a memory older than her own short life. She felt it stirring in her blood, the pulse of the ancestors, the strength of the foremothers who had once stood on battlefields and marketplaces alike, refusing to be silenced. She heard them now, whispering through the rustling of the baobab leaves, do not bow your head. Do not bend your knees. Walk forward, child. Her bare feet scraped against the earth as she moved, slow but certain, toward the fire at the center of it all. Toward her mother, still kneeling, still waiting for a justice that had never been meant for her. Ao stood stiffly, his hands still outstretched from where he had pushed Simi down. His eyes widened when he saw Zola approach. His mouth opened, perhaps to scold, to shame, to stop her, but no sound came. For the first time that night, it was not his voice that commanded the space. It was hers. Zola stepped into the firelight. The flames flickered across her skin, casting her in gold and crimson, making her small form seem larger than life. The villagers watched, frozen, by shame, by fear, by the heavy realization that something sacred was unfolding before them, and they could not stop it. She turned slowly, meeting their eyes one by one. The masks hid their faces, but not their guilt. Not their cowardice. Not their smallness. "You all saw," she said, her voice low but clear as river water. "You saw when he began to scold her for breathing. You saw when her laughter disappeared. You saw when her songs dried up like rivers in a drought." A whisper ran through the crowd, a ripple of unease. "You saw, and you did nothing," Zola said. "You said nothing. You let it happen, because it was easier to look away." The elders shifted uncomfortably on their stools, but none interrupted her. Even they knew that to stop her now would be to invite the wrath of the spirits themselves. Zola turned to her father. "And you," she said, voice trembling with emotion. "You broke her. You let your love rot like meat left in the sun. You listened to their poison, and you became the hand that hurt her instead of the arms that held her." Ao's face, stripped of its usual mask of pride, crumpled slightly. His fists clenched at his sides, but he did not speak. He could not. Simi's eyes, full of tears, watched her daughter with a mixture of awe and aching pride. She could hardly believe this fierce voice belonged to the tiny girl who had once hidden behind her skirts during storms. Zola breathed deeply, feeling the ancestors behind her, standing taller with every word. She lifted her chin. "I will not be silent," she said. "I will not pretend I do not see what you have done. I will not carry your shame." She knelt beside Simi, taking her mother's hand in both of hers. The firelight danced between them, weaving their shadows together into one unbreakable form. The leopard elder slowly rose from his stool. His mask caught the flames, glinting like a predator in the dark. "There are moments," he said, his voice grave, "when the truth, though feared, must be heard. This is such a moment." A hushed, reverent silence fell. Zola, clutching Simi's hand, felt the invisible chains around them snap, one by one, falling away into the dust. She had stepped into the firelight, and she had not burned. Zola stood beside her mother, their hands clasped tightly, as the fire crackled higher and the night seemed to lean closer, listening. Her heart pounded so fiercely it seemed to shake the ground beneath her, but her voice rose above it all, first small, then gathering strength, until it rolled over the gathering like a summer storm. At first, her words were soft, no more than the flutter of a sparrow's wings. "You do not know my mother," she said, voice quivering. "You do not see her." The villagers shifted uneasily. Some pulled their cloaks tighter. Others shuffled their feet in the dust. No one spoke. "You see a woman too proud to bow," Zola continued, her voice lifting. "But you do not see how she rose each morning before the sun, her hands blistered from grinding maize, her back bent under baskets heavier than her own heart. You do not see how she sang over the cooking fires, so we would believe that love still lived in our home." She paused, breathing hard, her small chest rising and falling like the wings of a hawk circling higher. "You see a woman who would not weep before you," she said, louder now, "but you do not know how she wept when the doors were shut, when the lamps were dark. How she wept not for herself, but for a man who forgot how to love her." The crowd stirred, a low, uneasy murmur running through it. Some of the elders exchanged glances beneath their solemn masks. The leopard elder's hands tightened around his staff, but he did not interrupt. Zola's voice grew stronger, deeper, fueled by the truth that had been bottled inside her for far too long. It was no longer the voice of a child, it was the voice of generations. It carried the weight of every woman who had swallowed her pain, every daughter who had watched in silence. "My father," she said, turning to Ao, who stood frozen as if carved from stone, "was a man of laughter once. A man who danced under the stars. But he let others twist his heart until he could no longer tell love from pride. He let their poison spill into our home, and it burned us worse than any fire." The words lashed through the village, sharp and merciless. Heads bowed. Hands trembled. A few women wiped their eyes beneath their masks. Zola stepped closer to the fire, its glow wreathing her in gold, turning her small figure into something fierce, something unstoppable. "You all helped him," she cried. "With your whispers behind closed doors, with your laughter when my mother faltered. You turned your faces away when kindness was crushed underfoot. You chose your comfort over what was right." Her voice thundered across the clearing, scattering the last illusions like dry leaves. "And the spirits wept for us," she said, voice thick with fury and sorrow. "I heard them. In the long nights when my mother held me close and we both shivered, not from cold, but from the emptiness he left behind." Her words became a river now, overflowing, washing away the lies and silences that had choked the village for too long. She spoke of the nights Simi had knelt by the ancestors' shrine, begging for Ao's heart to soften. She spoke of the quiet cruelty, the cold looks, the biting words, the public shaming meant to break her spirit. She spoke of how her mother had carried it all without letting it crush Zola's hope, how she had stitched together love from the tatters of her own broken heart. "You will no longer pretend," Zola said, her voice ringing out like a drumbeat. "You will see her. You will see what you did." The villagers listened, silent and stunned, as if struck by lightning. Simi, tears streaking her dust-smudged face, reached up and cupped her daughter's cheek. For a moment, the fire, the crowd, even the judgment of the elders seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them, mother and daughter, bound by a love no betrayal could sever. Ao, who had once stood so proud, so certain of his rightness, now seemed smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched, his mask of authority shattered. The leopard elder finally rose, his staff thudding against the earth. "You have spoken with the voice of the ancestors," he said, his voice deep and grave. "You have torn away the masks that shame wore." He turned to the villagers, his gaze fierce beneath his carved mask. "Let all here bear witness, when the children speak the truth, the earth itself must listen." The crowd bowed their heads, humbled, broken open by the fierce light of Zola's words. The drums, silent for so long, stirred at last, a slow, steady beat rising from the dust, deep as the heartbeat of the world itself. Zola stood tall, unflinching, as the night and the ancestors wrapped her in their invisible embrace. Truth had come, like thunder, and nothing would ever be the same again. Simi collapsed onto the hard, cracked earth, her body folding like a dry leaf under the weight of years unspoken. Her fingers dug into the dust as if trying to root herself to something real, something steady, while the world she had carefully stitched together, smile by smile, silence by silence, unraveled all at once under the fire of her daughter's words. Her sobs broke loose from her chest in great heaving waves, raw and guttural, the kind of cries that had been swallowed for too long. They filled the night air, crashing against the silent watchers like the tides of a stormy sea. The firelight flickered wildly, as if the very elements were trembling with her. For a moment, no one moved. The villagers stood stiff, statues carved of guilt and grief. Even Ao did not reach for her. His hands hung limp at his sides, the strength drained from him. Zola knelt beside her mother, tears streaming down her own face, but she did not speak. She placed a hand lightly on Simi's back, a touch full of patience, telling her without words, "You do not have to hide anymore." Simi's cries bled into the soil, into the roots of the baobab trees, into the ancient bones buried beneath the village. It was a mourning not just for herself, but for all the women who had been silenced, all the dreams strangled by duty, all the songs stilled by fear. The earth listened. And it answered. A soft breeze stirred, carrying the scent of rain from far-off places. The stars, hidden by the smoke of the feast fires, blinked through the haze, tiny stubborn lights refusing to be snuffed out. Simi's sobs slowed, became shudders, then sighs. Her body, exhausted and trembling, remained pressed to the earth. But inside her, something shifted. The shame, the self-blame that had wrapped around her heart like iron vines, began to loosen its grip. She remembered then, the first day she had met Ao, how her laughter had been free, wild, unafraid. She remembered dancing barefoot in the rain, remembered weaving songs for the harvest festival, remembered holding baby Zola against her breast and swearing that no matter what sorrow found her, she would build a life of light for her child. She had not failed. She had endured. She had survived. Slowly, like a sapling pushing up through the dry season's cracked soil, Simi lifted her head. Her face was streaked with dust and tears, but in the firelight, she looked almost holy, fierce and fragile and infinitely strong. She rose to her knees first, then to her feet. The village watched, breaths held tight. She did not need their approval. She did not even need their forgiveness. She had found something greater, herself. Simi's hands, once curled into fists of pain, opened wide, as if to catch the stars. She turned to face them all, her kin, her betrayers, her silent judges. Her gaze swept over them without fear. They had taken her pride once, but they could not take her dignity unless she let them. And she would not. I carried my love like a gift, she said, voice low but unshakable. You made it a weapon against me. But I will no longer bear your shame. I return it to you. The villagers shifted, uncomfortable, some looking down at their feet, others daring to meet her gaze and finding themselves burned by it. I have scars, she said, laying a hand over her heart. But I am not broken. I am not less. I am more. Every tear, every humiliation, every silent night made me stronger. Zola stepped forward, her small hand finding her mother's. Together they stood, two flames in the night, refusing to be blown out. Ao finally moved, taking a step toward them, but it was not the step of a man commanding obedience. It was the step of someone who realized he was lost, who had thrown away something precious and could never gather all the pieces again. Simi looked at him. Her face softened, not with forgiveness, not yet, but with the peace of one who no longer carried another's guilt. I loved you once, she said. And that love was true. But a woman cannot plant a seed alone and call it a garden. Ao bowed his head. There were no words he could offer to undo what had been done. Simi turned away, her chin high. She walked back to the feast fires, to the life waiting for her, a life not built on fear, but on truth. The women of the village watched her with new eyes, something like awe dawning on their faces. The younger girls clutched each other's hands, hope blooming in their hearts. The ancestors stirred in the dust, murmuring blessings. From the ashes of shame, Simi rose, not broken, but reborn, her pain shining around her like armor, like a crown. And the drums, silent for so long, began to beat again, slow, steady, full of promise. Ao stood in the middle of the gathering, and for the first time in his life, no one looked at him with respect. No one sought his approval. The elders, who had once praised his strength and judgment, turned their faces away. The villagers, who had once nodded and smiled when he passed, now shifted and murmured among themselves, their gazes full of something harsher than anger, disappointment. The fire crackled between them all, throwing long shadows across the clearing. Somewhere deep in the earth, the ancestral drums seemed to pound, a sound not made by human hands but by the spirits themselves. It was not music. It was a judgment. Ao opened his mouth, as if to protest, to explain, but the words died in his throat. What could he say? That he had been poisoned by pride? That he had let whispers turn his heart into stone? That he had loved once, truly, but let that love rot in the soil of bitterness? There was nothing left to defend. The leopard elder, once Ao's greatest supporter, stood stiffly and lifted his staff. His voice cut through the thick night air, sharp and clear. A man who forgets the worth of the ones who love him, he said, forgets the very path he walks. He becomes a stranger to his ancestors. A tree that severs its roots will fall. Ao flinched as if struck. Around him, the villagers nodded solemnly. It was not only Simi he had hurt, it was the village, the community, the invisible threads that bound them all. He saw the women gathering around Simi and Zola, their hands reaching out in support, their faces lit with a fierce tenderness. He saw the men lower their heads, some ashamed they had once laughed along, once turned a blind eye. No one moved toward him. No one offered a hand. Even his own mother, her back hunched with age, refused to meet his gaze. Alone. The word echoed inside him, hollow and cold. The spirit's judgment was not thunder or lightning striking him down, it was this, the silence. The unbearable weight of knowing he had carved out his own exile with every cruel word, every dismissal, every time he had chosen pride over compassion. He thought back to the early days with Simi. Her laughter had once been the music of his life, her spirit a flame that warmed him through the coldest nights. She had danced for him beneath the baobab trees, weaving dreams with her hands and her voice. And he had crushed it all, like a man too blind to recognize gold until it turned to ash in his hands. The drums in the earth pounded again, deep and slow, like the heartbeat of judgment itself. In the old ways, a man who dishonored his family might be cast out, forced to wander, seeking redemption if he could find it. Ao understood now. No punishment they could give would be harsher than this, standing at the center of everything he had once loved and feeling utterly and completely alone. He staggered backward a step, the firelight making his shadow dance grotesquely on the dusty ground. His mouth tasted of ash. His chest ached with something deeper than sorrow, the realization that his pride, once his shield, had become his prison. Some part of him wanted to rage, to shout that he was not the only one at fault. But he knew it would be a lie. In the silence, in the gathering dark, there was no room for lies anymore. Ao sank to his knees, dust billowing around him, and bowed his head to the earth. The ancestors watched. The village watched. The stars watched. He was no longer a proud husband, no longer a respected man. He was simply a figure hollowed out by his own mistakes, left to gather the shards of himself, if he could. The spirit's drums softened, almost tender now, as if saying, "Fall, and rise again if you can. But never forget." The night deepened around him, and Ao wept, not for forgiveness, for he had not yet earned it, but for the boy he once was, the man he might have been, and the love he had thrown away. And still, the drums beat on. Simi and Zola stood at the edge of the village, their backs to the ruins of what had once been their home. The fires of the feast had long since dimmed, and the echoes of the ancestral drums were fading into the distance. The air was thick with dust, heavy with the weight of what had been, but lighter for what would come. Simi took a deep breath, inhaling the earth's scent, the same earth that had both nourished and betrayed her. She could feel it beneath her feet, grounding her, holding her steady as she prepared to leave behind a lifetime of wounds. Zola, her small hand still holding tightly to her mother's, looked up at her, her face lit with something new. It wasn't the fear or sadness that had clung to them both for so long, no, this was hope. Real hope. The kind that rises, even from the deepest of sorrows. Without a word, Simi began to walk, her feet bare against the hot earth. Zola followed, her footsteps light but sure. They moved toward the horizon, away from the village that had once been their world, away from the cold looks and whispers that had filled their hearts with shame. Each step was a small victory. Each step was an act of defiance, an act of freedom. The path was unfamiliar, and the land stretched out in front of them like an open promise, vast and untamed. But Simi and Zola were no longer afraid of the unknown. They had learned that the unknown held both danger and beauty, and it was theirs to conquer now. Together. As they walked, Simi began to hum a melody, low and steady, like a river winding through the night. Zola joined in, her voice light and clear, the sound of it weaving through the air like the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. It was a song they had learned in dreams, a song passed down from their ancestors, carried in the blood of women who had known both suffering and strength. The words were ancient, but the meaning was fresh, alive in their hearts. We rise like the sun, born again from the ashes. We dance with the winds, for the storm has passed. The chains that bound us, now fall to the earth. And with each step, we forge our freedom. The melody carried them forward, like a wind behind their backs, urging them on, steady and strong. As they sang, Simi's body seemed to lighten. The weight of years, of silence, of shame, began to slip away, leaving only the strength of who she had always been, a woman who had endured, a woman who had never stopped loving, a mother who would never stop protecting her child. Zola's voice, high and clear, rang out beside her mother's. There was no more fear in her. No more trembling. Only the power of her words, her own truth now woven into the tapestry of their journey. They sang not only for themselves but for the other women who had lived in shadows, for the ones who had suffered in silence, for the daughters who would one day walk their own paths. Their voices rose up like the sun, shining light on the path ahead. The village, now far behind them, had been a place of captivity for both of them. But Simi knew the truth: the chains were never in the earth or the village walls. They had been inside her, inside the stories she had been told, inside the fear that had kept her small, quiet. The chains had been her own, and now they were falling away, piece by piece, with every step they took. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the tall grasses around them, as if the world itself was acknowledging their freedom. The land ahead of them was untamed, but it was theirs to explore, theirs to claim. At the top of a small hill, Simi paused, looking out at the endless stretch of earth before them. There were no limits now. Only open sky and wide, unmarked land. She felt Zola's hand slip into hers again, warm and steady, and she smiled. "Where do we go now, Mama?" Zola asked, her voice full of wonder. Simi looked down at her daughter, her heart swelling with something deep and beautiful. The answer was simple. "We go forward, my love. We go forward." And so they walked. The past no longer bound them. The wounds were healing, and the future, a future they would create with their own hands, was waiting for them, unmarked and full of promise. The sun was setting as they continued on their journey, the colors of the sky painting the earth in shades of gold and crimson. It was a new beginning, born from the ashes of the old, and with every step they took, Simi and Zola knew, they were free. Years had passed since Simi and Zola walked away from the old village. The sun now dipped low in the sky, casting its golden hues over the land that had once seemed so vast and uncertain. The baobab tree stood tall and strong, its branches reaching for the heavens as if they, too, were trying to grasp the future. Underneath its wide, protective branches, a new generation gathered. Zola, now a young woman with the same fire in her eyes that had once burned in her mother's, sat on the soft earth, her daughter curled up beside her, eager and wide-eyed. The rhythms of life had changed, but one thing remained constant: the power of stories. Zola's voice, now rich with the wisdom of experience, carried in the evening air as she spoke. Her hands, steady and graceful, traced the shapes of the words in the air as she told the story of her mother, of their journey, and of the power that had come from one small voice. "Once, there was a time when the world seemed too big, too harsh," Zola began, her voice soft but resolute. "My mother, Simi, was a woman like many others, strong, beautiful, but broken in ways no one could see. She carried wounds that weren't always visible, but they were real. And one day, in the face of betrayal and cruelty, my mother found herself standing at the edge of everything, and that was when the most extraordinary thing happened. Her daughter, a little girl no older than 5, gazed up at her with wide, curious eyes, hanging on to every word. She could not fully grasp the weight of the past, but she understood the power of the story." Zola smiled, feeling the pulse of her ancestors in her veins as she continued. "You see, there was a man, my father, Ao." Zola's voice tightened for a moment, but she continued. "He was a man who had once been kind, but his pride had turned him cold. He hurt my mother in ways that words cannot capture. But the story I want you to remember, my dear, is not his. It is hers." Zola paused for a moment, letting the wind carry the silence between them. The baobab tree whispered in the evening breeze, as if agreeing with her words. "My mother, your grandmother, had suffered in silence for so long. Her heart had been broken, her spirit dimmed. But on one fateful day, when the whole village gathered under the firelight, something changed. A spark of courage, a single, quiet voice, rose from the depths of her pain." Zola's hand rested on her daughter's, the warmth between them a bridge to the past. My mother, for the first time, spoke the truth. She did not let her shame hold her anymore. She told the world of the cruelty she had endured, and of the love she had given so freely, even when it had been taken for granted. And in that moment, everything changed. The little girl nestled closer to her mother, sensing the weight of the story, but also the light that now filled Zola's voice. She continued, her tone filled with both love and reverence. It was my mother's voice that shattered the silence, that broke the chains that had bound us. And when the time came for my father to face the consequences of his actions, it wasn't the strength of a mighty king or the words of 1,000 warriors that defeated him. It was the strength of her voice, small, but powerful, like the river that carves its path through the hardest stone. Zola's eyes glistened as she looked out over the horizon, her thoughts drifting back to those days. The winds of change had swept them from the old village, but in the process, they had found something far greater, the strength that had always resided in them. She had learned from her mother that even the smallest voice could ripple through the world and change its course. The ancestors had whispered this truth to her in her dreams, and now, it was her turn to pass it on. My mother taught me, Zola continued, that you don't need to be loud to be heard. You don't need to be the strongest to be powerful. Sometimes, the smallest voice, the quietest one, the one that trembles with truth, is the one that carries the most weight. Her daughter's eyes were wide, absorbing every word, the message sinking deep into her soul. Zola leaned forward, her voice soft but firm as she spoke the final words of the story. And that is why, my love, you must always speak when it is time, even if the world seems like it's too big for your voice. Speak, because the river will change its course. Speak, because you can. The evening sun set lower, and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, each one a witness to the generations that had come before and those that would follow. Zola gazed up at the baobab tree, its ancient branches stretching far above them. She could feel the spirits of the ancestors stirring, their presence surrounding her, proud of how far they had come. Her daughter, sensing the depth of the moment, stood up on her little feet, gazing at the world beyond the tree. She turned to her mother, a bright smile spreading across her face. I will speak, Mama, she said, her voice small but filled with promise. I will be like you. Like Grandma. Zola's heart swelled. She nodded, pride and love welling in her chest. Yes, you will, my child. Yes, you will. And as the firelight flickered and the cool night air wrapped around them, Zola knew the truth of the story would live on, not just in the words she spoke, but in the generations that would follow. The legacy of strength, of truth, and of the small, mighty voices that had changed the course of history would carry on, through every woman, through every daughter, through every mother who had the courage to speak. And under the baobab tree, the winds whispered the same truth that had echoed for generations, even the smallest voice can change the course of the river.